The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pentagon's marble corridors as Admiral Sarah Mitchell adjusted her uniform one final time before entering the briefing room. At 42, she had earned every stripe, every medal, and every scar that marked her journey from a small-town girl with big dreams to one of the most decorated female Navy SEALs in American history. Her presence commanded respect, though she never demanded it. The briefing room buzzed with quiet conversation as various military personnel prepared for the Joint Operations meeting. Among them sat Lieutenant Commander Jake Reynolds, a cocky young SEAL who had recently returned from his first deployment. His chest was puffed with pride, and his eyes held the dangerous gleam of someone who believed his recent combat experience made him untouchable. Sarah entered the room with the quiet confidence that had carried her through countless missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and classified operations that would never see the light of day. She had spent the last 18 months coordinating special operations between multiple branches of the military, a role that required not just tactical brilliance, but diplomatic finesse. Her reputation preceded her wherever she went, but she preferred to let her work speak for itself. As she made her way to her designated seat, Reynolds caught sight of her approaching. He had heard whispers about some female officer who supposedly had an impressive record, but looking at Sarah's relatively modest rank insignia compared to his own inflated sense of importance, he couldn't resist making what he thought was a clever observation. "Well, well," Reynolds said loudly enough for half the room to hear, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Looks like they're letting anyone into these high-level briefings these days. What's next?" "Bringing in the secretaries to take notes." 1. The room fell silent. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing Sarah but unsure how she would respond to such blatant disrespect. Sarah paused, her hand resting on the back of her chair. She had faced down enemy combatants, survived interrogation training that broke seasoned soldiers, and had once single-handedly coordinated the rescue of 12 hostages from a terrorist compound. A mouthy lieutenant commander was hardly her greatest challenge. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant Commander," Sarah said calmly, her voice carrying just enough authority to make Reynolds straighten slightly. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Admiral Sarah Mitchell, Naval Special Warfare Command." Reynolds' smirk faltered for just a moment, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. He had heard the name Mitchell before, but surely this couldn't be the same person. After all, the stories he'd heard seemed too incredible to be true, and certainly not about someone who looked like the woman standing before him. "Admiral?" Reynolds laughed, the sound harsh and grating in the now silent room. "Come on. What's your real rank? Did you get that title from some desk job in logistics? I mean, no offense, but I've been in actual combat. I've seen real action. I think there might be some mistake about who should be sitting where in this room." The tension in the room was palpable. Several junior officers looked mortified, while the more senior personnel watched with a mixture of anticipation and concern. They knew something Reynolds clearly didn't, and they were about to witness a moment that would become military legend. Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted prey. "Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, isn't it? I've read your file. Impressive work in Syria last month. That hostage extraction was particularly well executed, though I did notice a few tactical decisions that could have been improved." Reynolds blinked, caught off guard that she not only knew his name but had apparently studied his missions. "How do you? I mean, that operation is still classified." "Yes, it is," Sarah replied simply. "I should know. I'm the one who designed the operational framework you used. Every SEAL team has been implementing protocols I developed based on my experiences in similar situations." "That building entry technique that saved your team? I pioneered that method during a mission in Kandahar in 2019. The color began to drain from Reynolds' face, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but..." His words were cut short as the briefing room door opened and 4 figures entered in succession. The first was General Patricia Hayes, a stern woman whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by her intolerance for incompetence. Behind her came General Marcus Thompson, whose chest full of ribbons told the story of 3 decades of distinguished service. Following him was General David Chen, the youngest man ever to achieve 4-star rank, and finally, General Robert Martinez, whose very presence seemed to command the attention of everyone in the room. The moment these 4 generals spotted Admiral Mitchell, something extraordinary happened. Without hesitation, without a moment's pause, all 4 snapped to perfect attention. Their spines straightened, their chins lifted, and in perfect unison, they rendered the most crisp, precise salutes that Reynolds had ever witnessed. "Admiral Mitchell," General Hayes said, her voice carrying deep respect. "It's an honor to serve alongside you again." The room was so quiet that the sound of Reynolds' coffee cup hitting the table seemed to echo like a gunshot. Every eye in the room turned to watch his reaction as the full weight of his mistake began to settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Sarah returned the salutes with equal precision, her bearing transforming from approachable colleague to commanding officer in an instant. "Generals," she acknowledged, "thank you for making time for this briefing. I believe we have some important matters to discuss regarding the upcoming joint operations." Reynolds sat frozen in his chair, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The woman he had dismissed as a secretary or desk officer was now receiving the respect and deference of 4 of the most powerful military leaders in the country. His mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. But the evidence was undeniable. General Thompson approached Sarah with a warm smile. "Admiral, I wanted to personally thank you for the tactical recommendations you provided for Operation Silent Thunder. The mission was a complete success, and we had 0 casualties thanks to your insights." "Just doing my job, General," Sarah replied modestly. "Though I'm glad to hear the team executed flawlessly. They deserved better intelligence going in. And I'm sorry we couldn't provide more detailed reconnaissance." General Chen stepped forward next. "Admiral, the President specifically asked me to convey his appreciation for your work on the counter-terrorism initiative," he said. And I quote, "Admiral Mitchell's strategic thinking has made America safer, and every citizen owes her a debt of gratitude." As Reynolds listened to this exchange, the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with devastating clarity. The Admiral Sarah Mitchell wasn't just some officer who happened to share a name with the legendary SEAL he'd heard stories about. She was the legendary SEAL. She was the woman who had personally eliminated 3 high-value terrorist targets in a single mission. She was the officer who had developed half the tactics his own team used in the field. She was the leader who had been personally decorated by 2 different presidents for her service to the nation. The stories he had dismissed as exaggerated legends were not only true but apparently understated. This was the woman who had once spent 6 months undercover in enemy territory, gathering intelligence that led to the dismantling of an entire terrorist network. This was the officer who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions. Not because she had to, but because she knew she had the skills to succeed where others might fail. Reynolds felt his face burning with embarrassment as he realized that every person in the room was now looking at him with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. He had just insulted one of the most respected officers in the entire military, and he had done it in front of witnesses who would never forget his arrogance and ignorance. General Martinez, the most senior of the 4 generals, stepped closer to Sarah with an expression of genuine warmth and respect. His weathered face bore the marks of a man who had seen decades of conflict, and his eyes held the wisdom that came from leading soldiers through impossible situations. "Admiral Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "I've been meaning to speak with you personally. The operation you coordinated in Somalia last year saved not just the lives of our people, but prevented what could have been an international incident. Your decision to abort the initial plan and develop an alternative strategy on the spot was nothing short of brilliant." Sarah nodded graciously. "The intelligence changed, General. When the situation on the ground shifted, we had to adapt. That's what we trained for." "Adapt?" General Martinez chuckled. "Admiral, you didn't just adapt. You completely redesigned a complex multi-phase operation in under 4 hours, coordinated with 3 different nations' special forces, and executed a flawless extraction under impossible conditions. The Pentagon still uses that mission as a case study for crisis management. Reynolds felt his stomach dropping further with each word. The Somalia operation was legendary among Special Forces personnel. He had studied it during his advanced training, analyzing every tactical decision and marveling at the strategic brilliance demonstrated throughout the mission. The unknown architect of that operation had been sitting right across from him, and he had treated her like an unwelcome intruder. Colonel Janet Stevens, who had been quietly observing from the corner of the room, stepped forward. She was a Marine officer whose own reputation was formidable, and her expression as she looked at Reynolds was one of barely contained disgust. "Lieutenant Commander," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade, "I believe you owe Admiral Mitchell an apology. Your behavior has been not only disrespectful, but embarrassingly unprofessional." Reynolds opened his mouth to speak, but found that words had abandoned him completely. How could he possibly apologize for such a massive error in judgment? How could he explain that his arrogance had blinded him to the obvious signs of Sarah's expertise and authority? The insignia on her uniform, which he had dismissed as unimpressive, now seemed to glow with significance. Every ribbon, every medal, every mark of distinction told the story of a career that dwarfed his own accomplishments. Sarah raised a hand gently, her gesture stopping Colonel Stevens from continuing. "It's all right, Colonel. We all make assumptions sometimes. What matters is how we learn from them." Her grace under pressure only served to highlight Reynolds' behavior more starkly. Here was a woman who could have destroyed his career with a single phone call, who had every right to demand his immediate transfer or disciplinary action, and she was choosing to show mercy. The contrast between her professionalism and his juvenile outburst was stark and humiliating. General Hayes turned to address the room. For those who may not be familiar with Admiral Mitchell's complete record, perhaps a brief overview would be educational. She fixed Reynolds with a steely gaze that made it clear this lesson was specifically for his benefit. "Admiral Mitchell graduated first in her class from the Naval Academy," General Hayes began, her voice taking on the tone of someone reciting an impressive resume. "She then became one of only a handful of women to successfully complete Navy SEAL training, not only graduating, but setting records in multiple categories that still stand today." Reynolds remembered hearing about those records during his own training. The instructors had spoken about them with reverence, describing achievements that seemed almost superhuman. The idea that the person who had set those standards was standing a few feet away from him was almost surreal. "Her first deployment took her to Afghanistan," General Hayes continued, "where she spent 14 months conducting high-risk reconnaissance missions deep in enemy territory. During that time, she provided intelligence that led to the capture or elimination of over 30 high-value targets." The room remained silent, but Reynolds could feel the weight of disapproval from every person present. His fellow officers, who had initially seemed amused by his boldness, now looked at him with expressions of embarrassment and secondhand shame. "Following her service in Afghanistan," General Hayes went on, "Admiral Mitchell was selected for an undercover operation in Iraq that lasted 8 months. The details remain classified, but I can say that her work during that period prevented multiple terrorist attacks on civilian targets and saved countless innocent lives." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, clearly preferring not to be the center of attention. "General, I think we have more pressing matters to discuss in today's briefing." "Actually, Admiral, I think this is exactly the kind of discussion we need to have," General Thompson interjected. "Too often, we fail to recognize excellence when it's standing right in front of us. Your record speaks for itself, but more importantly, your character and leadership have inspired an entire generation of special operations personnel." Colonel Stevens nodded in agreement. "Admiral Mitchell has personally trained over 200 special operations soldiers. Her tactical innovations have been adopted by every branch of the military, and her leadership principles are taught at the War College." Reynolds felt as though the walls of the room were closing in on him. Every word being spoken highlighted not just Sarah's extraordinary accomplishments, but also the magnitude of his disrespect. He had insulted a woman whose tactical knowledge had probably saved his own life during missions he didn't even know she had influenced. Captain Morrison, a Navy SEAL commander who had been sitting quietly in the corner, finally spoke up. Admiral Mitchell was my instructor during advanced warfare training. She pushed us harder than we thought possible. But she also taught us that true strength comes from discipline, respect, and humility. Apparently, those lessons don't always stick. His pointed look at Reynolds made it clear that the entire special operations community would soon know about this incident. In a brotherhood where reputation was everything, Reynolds had just damaged his standing in a way that might never be repaired. Sarah sensed the mounting tension in the room and decided to redirect the conversation. Gentlemen, ladies, while I appreciate your kind words, we have important work to do. Lieutenant Commander Reynolds made an honest mistake, and I'm sure he'll learn from this experience. Her diplomatic intervention was masterful, providing Reynolds with a face-saving exit from his predicament, while simultaneously demonstrating the kind of leadership that had earned her such widespread respect. She was choosing to focus on the mission rather than personal grievances. Even when she had every right to feel offended, General Chen stepped forward with a tablet in his hand. Admiral, I have the preliminary reports from Operation Midnight Sunday. Your strategic recommendations were implemented exactly as you outlined, and the results exceeded our most optimistic projections. I'm glad to hear it went smoothly, General. The team leaders deserves the credit for flawless execution under difficult conditions. The team leaders specifically requested that I thank you personally, General Chen replied. They said your pre-mission briefing and tactical guidance were the difference between success and potential disaster. Reynolds realized that even as this meeting was taking place, Sarah's influence was being felt in active operations around the world. While he had been sitting in this room making jokes about her qualifications, real soldiers in real danger were relying on her expertise to bring them home safely. The magnitude of his error was becoming clearer by the moment. But what struck him most was not just Sarah's professional accomplishments, but her personal response to his disrespect. She could have humiliated him, ended his career, or simply ignored him entirely. She was actively protecting his reputation while still allowing him to learn from his mistake. This was leadership at its finest, and Reynolds was beginning to understand why 4 generals had saluted her with such obvious respect and admiration. As the formal briefing began, Reynolds found himself in the unique position of observing true leadership in action. Sarah took her place at the head of the conference table, and the transformation was immediate and striking. The woman who had shown him such grace and mercy moments earlier now commanded the room with an authority that was both natural and absolute. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah began, her voice carrying easily through the room, we're here to discuss Operation Thunder Ridge, a joint mission that will require unprecedented coordination between our Special Operations Forces and our international allies. The large screen at the front of the room came to life, displaying satellite imagery of a mountainous region that Reynolds recognized as somewhere in Eastern Europe. The terrain looked treacherous, with steep cliffs, dense forests, and weather patterns that would challenge even the most experienced operators. The situation is complex, Sarah continued, using a laser pointer to highlight specific areas on the map. We have reliable intelligence indicating that a terrorist cell has established a training facility in this region. However, the compound is located in disputed territory, which means any operation must be conducted with absolute precision to avoid international complications. General Hayes leaned forward in her chair. Admiral, what's your assessment of the primary challenges we'll face? Sarah's response was immediate and comprehensive. Weather will be our biggest enemy. The region experiences sudden temperature drops that can incapacitate personnel within minutes. Additionally, the terrain provides excellent defensive positions for enemy forces, while limiting our approach options to 3 narrow corridors that could easily become kill zones. Reynolds found himself genuinely fascinated despite his earlier embarrassment. This was military strategy at the highest level, and Sarah was discussing incredibly complex tactical considerations with the kind of casual expertise that most officers could only dream of possessing. However, Sarah continued, I believe these challenges also present opportunities. The same weather patterns that threaten our people will also limit enemy visibility and communications. If we time our approach correctly, we can use the natural conditions as cover." General Thompson nodded approvingly. "What about insertion methods? Traditional helicopter deployment seems impossible given the terrain." "It is, AT. You're absolutely right, General. Which is why I'm recommending a halo jump insertion from 30,000 feet, followed by a 15-mile approach on foot through terrain that will require alpine climbing expertise." Colonel Stevens raised an eyebrow. "That's an extremely demanding insertion method. How many personnel do we have with the necessary mountaineering skills?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time since the meeting began, Reynolds saw a hint of the warrior who had earned her reputation through action rather than words. "Every member of the proposed team has extensive high-altitude training. In fact, most of them learned their climbing skills from me during advanced warfare courses I taught at Quantico." The casual mention of her teaching experience hit Reynolds like a physical blow. He realized that Sarah hadn't just participated in legendary operations. She had been training the next generation of special operators to carry on that legacy. Her influence extended far beyond her own missions, to encompass the careers and capabilities of hundreds of other soldiers. General Martinez studied the tactical display with obvious interest. "Admiral, this is brilliant work, but I have to ask about extraction. Getting the team in is one thing, but how do we get them out with potential prisoners and intelligence materials?" "I'm glad you asked, General." Sarah manipulated the display to show a different view of the terrain. "There's a lake approximately 8 miles from the target compound. The water is deep enough for submarine approach, and the surrounding area provides multiple defensible positions for a temporary base of operations." The room fell silent as the implications of her plan became clear. She wasn't just proposing a raid. She was outlining a complex, multi-phase operation that would require coordination between land, air, and sea assets. The level of detail and strategic thinking required for such planning was extraordinary. Captain Morrison spoke up from his position near the back of the room. "Admiral, have you personally reconnoitered this terrain?" "I spent 3 weeks in the region last summer," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "Officially, I was there as part of a NATO training exercise. Unofficially, I was gathering intelligence on potential operational areas. Every route I'm proposing has been personally tested under similar weather conditions." Reynolds felt his jaw dropping open. While other officers had been attending conferences and managing paperwork, Sarah had been personally conducting reconnaissance in hostile territory. She hadn't just planned this operation from satellite imagery and intelligence reports. She had been there, seen the challenges firsthand, and developed solutions based on actual experience. General Chen pulled up additional files on his tablet. "The intelligence package you've prepared is incredibly comprehensive. How did you manage to gather such detailed information on enemy positions and capabilities?" Sarah's expression became more serious. "Some of that information came at considerable cost, General. We lost 2 assets in the process of gathering intelligence on the facility's defensive arrangements. Their sacrifice cannot be forgotten, and this mission is our opportunity to ensure their deaths were not in vain." The room fell silent as everyone present absorbed the weight of that statement. These weren't just tactical considerations or strategic planning exercises. Real people had died to make this operation possible, and the responsibility for their sacrifice rested heavily on everyone involved. Reynolds finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Admiral, I owe you an apology." Sarah turned to look at him, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Lieutenant Commander?" Standing up from his chair, Reynolds felt every eye in the room focusing on him. His face burned with embarrassment. But he knew that this moment would define not just his relationship with Sarah, but his entire future as a military officer. "Ma'am, my behavior earlier was inexcusable. I made assumptions based on prejudice and arrogance, and I disrespected not only you personally, but everything you represent as a leader and a warrior. I have no excuse for my conduct, and I understand if you choose to file a formal complaint." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. "Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, do you know why I didn't immediately correct your assumptions when you first spoke to me?" "No, ma'am. Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought you were talking to someone you perceived as inferior. Character isn't revealed when we're trying to impress our superiors. It's revealed when we think nobody important is watching." The truth of that statement hit Reynolds like a physical blow. In those first few minutes of conversation, he had revealed himself to be exactly the kind of officer he had always claimed to despise. Arrogant, prejudiced, and dismissive of others, based on superficial judgments. "However," Sarah continued, "I've also seen how you've responded to learning about your mistake. You could have tried to minimize your error, make excuses, or simply hoped everyone would forget about it. Instead, you're taking responsibility and offering a genuine apology. That tells me something important about your character as well." General Hayes nodded in agreement. Admiral Mitchell is known for her ability to see potential in people, even when they've made significant errors in judgment. "Lieutenant Commander Reynolds," Sarah said, "I'm not going to file a complaint, but I am going to give you an assignment. You're going to spend the next 6 months working directly with me on special operations planning. You'll learn not just tactical considerations, but the leadership principles that separate good officers from great ones." Reynolds felt a mixture of relief and terror. Working directly with Admiral Mitchell would be an incredible opportunity, but it would also mean constant scrutiny and the need to prove himself every single day. "Furthermore," Sarah added, "you're going to personally apologize to every female officer in this building. Not because I'm requiring it, but because it's the right thing to do. Your comments today weren't just directed at me. They reflected poorly on your attitude toward all women in uniform." "Yes, ma'am, I understand." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Lieutenant Commander, we all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them and grow as leaders and human beings. I believe you have the potential to become an excellent officer. But that will require leaving your ego behind and focusing on serving something greater than yourself." The meeting continued for another hour, with detailed planning for Operation Thunder Ridge and coordination between the various military branches represented. Throughout the discussion, Reynolds observed Sarah's leadership style with new appreciation. She listened more than she spoke, asked questions that revealed the depth of her strategic thinking, and consistently gave credit to others while taking responsibility for any potential problems. When the meeting finally concluded, the 4 generals approached Sarah once more. This time, their conversation was more casual, but no less respectful. "Admiral," General Martinez said, "I wanted you to know that the President has personally approved your promotion recommendation package. You'll be receiving your 4th star next month." Sarah smiled genuinely for the first time all day. "That's wonderful news, General. Though I hope this means I'll get even more challenging assignments, rather than a desk job in Washington." "Oh, I think we can guarantee that," General Thompson laughed. "In fact, there's a situation developing in the Pacific that requires exactly your kind of expertise." As the senior officers filed out of the room, Reynolds remained seated, still processing everything that had happened. Sarah approached him as he prepared to leave. "Lieutenant Commander," she said, "I want you to remember something important. The rank on someone's uniform doesn't tell you everything about who they are or what they've accomplished. True leadership isn't about demanding respect. It's about earning it through service, sacrifice, and dedication to something bigger than yourself." Reynolds nodded, finally understanding the lesson that had been so painfully delivered. "Admiral, I promise you won't regret giving me this opportunity. I'm counting on it," Sarah replied. "And, Lieutenant Commander, next time you meet someone new, try listening before you start talking. You might be surprised what you can learn." As Sarah left the room, Reynolds sat alone with his thoughts. He had entered that briefing as a cocky young officer who thought his recent combat experience made him special. He was leaving as someone who finally understood the difference between being a soldier and being a leader. The woman he had dismissed and insulted had just given him the opportunity of a lifetime, and he was determined not to waste it. The story of his encounter with Admiral Mitchell would follow him throughout his career, but not as a mark of shame. Instead, it would serve as a constant reminder of the importance of humility, respect, and the understanding that true greatness often comes in packages we don't expect.